I sat in the mahogany-paneled office, my calloused hands fidgeting with the brim of my worn baseball cap. The lawyer's voice droned on, but my attention kept drifting to my brother Marcus, who sat across from me in his expensive suit, checking his phone with practiced indifference. "To my grandson Marcus," the lawyer continued, "I leave my business holdings, investments, and liquid assets totaling approximately $10 million. Marcus didn't even look up. 10 million was probably just another Tuesday for him. "And to my grandson Jake," the lawyer's voice seemed to soften, "I leave my 1952 Ford 8N tractor, currently housed in the barn on the family property." The room fell silent. I felt heat creep up my neck as I processed what I'd just heard. A tractor, a rusty, decades-old tractor that probably hadn't run in years. Marcus finally looked up from his phone, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's it?" I managed to ask. The lawyer nodded sympathetically. "There's also a note." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandpa's shaky handwriting. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Everyone was staring. Marcus, the lawyer, even the secretary who'd been pretending not to listen. Their expressions ranged from pity to barely concealed amusement. "Well," I said, forcing a smile, "I guess I better go see about that tractor." As I walked out, I heard Marcus chuckle behind me. "Good luck with that rust bucket, little brother." The 40-minute drive to Grandpa's farm felt like the longest journey of my life. I kept replaying the will reading in my mind, each repetition making the sting worse. $10 million versus a broken-down tractor. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what it represented. Marcus had always been the golden child. Harvard MBA, successful tech company, penthouse apartment in the city. Meanwhile, I'd spent the last 5 years helping Grandpa maintain the farm, fixing fences, feeding livestock, and listening to his stories about the old days. I thought that meant something. I thought he understood that I was the one who truly cared about preserving what he'd built. But apparently, caring doesn't pay the bills or impress lawyers. The familiar sight of the weathered farmhouse came into view, its white paint peeling and the front porch sagging slightly under the weight of too many seasons. Grandpa's old pickup truck still sat in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of dust. I parked and sat for a moment, staring at the barn where my inheritance waited. The envelope from the lawyer crinkled in my pocket as I shifted. I hadn't opened it yet. Wasn't sure I wanted to read whatever final words Grandpa had left for the grandson who got the consolation prize. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and I could almost see Grandpa sitting on the porch, waving as I pulled up for another weekend of work. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the truck and headed toward the barn. The barn door creaked as I pulled it open, the sound echoing in the dusty silence. Afternoon light streamed through gaps in the weathered boards, illuminating dancing particles of dust and hay. The familiar smell of motor oil, leather, and decades of farm work filled my nostrils. There it sat in the center of the barn, Grandpa's 1952 Ford 8N tractor. Red paint faded to a dull orange, rust spots blooming like flowers across its metal surface. The seat was cracked leather, held together with duct tape, and the steering wheel showed the wear of countless hands. I'd seen this tractor 1,000 times, but I'd never really looked at it. Grandpa always kept it covered with an old tarp, claiming it was retired, and that the newer John Deere was all we needed for farm work. Walking around it slowly, I noticed things I'd missed before. The tires, while old, weren't cracked. Someone had been maintaining this machine. The engine bay was surprisingly clean, and when I checked the oil dipstick, it came up black, but at the proper level. I pulled the envelope from my pocket and tore it open. Grandpa's handwriting was shakier than usual, but the words were clear. "Jake, this old girl has more stories than you know. She's been waiting for the right person to wake her up." The key is in the usual place. Trust in what you can't see, and remember, sometimes the best treasures are the ones that don't shine. Love, Grandpa. The usual place. I smiled despite everything. That meant the magnetic key holder under the left fender. I knelt beside the tractor and ran my hand along the underside of the left fender until my fingers found the small magnetic box. Inside, just as Grandpa had said, was a single brass key, worn smooth from years of use. Climbing onto the cracked seat felt strange, like I was trespassing on sacred ground. The steering wheel was warm from the afternoon sun streaming through the barn door. I inserted the key into the ignition and paused, Grandpa's words echoing in my mind. Trust in what you can't see. What did that mean? I looked around the barn, searching for clues, but saw only the usual collection of farm tools, spare parts, and forgotten projects that accumulate over decades of rural life. Taking a deep breath, I turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a sound that was far too smooth for a machine this old. The whole tractor vibrated with power, but it was a controlled vibration, like a cat purring. This wasn't the death rattle I'd expected from a 70-year-old piece of farm equipment. As the engine warmed up, I noticed something odd. The fuel gauge, which should have been pointing to empty after sitting unused for years, showed 3/4 full, and the hour meter, the device that tracks how long the engine has been running, showed impossibly low numbers for a tractor this age. I revved the engine experimentally. It responded immediately, powerfully. This machine had been meticulously maintained, possibly even restored. But when? And why had Grandpa kept it secret? My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hope you enjoy your new lawnmower." I smiled and put the phone away. Something told me this was much more than a lawnmower. I decided to take the tractor for a test drive around the property. As I backed out of the barn, the steering was surprisingly responsive, and the transmission shifted smoothly through its gears. This wasn't just a restored tractor, it was a perfectly maintained machine. Driving past the old apple orchard, I remembered Grandpa's stories about planting those trees with this very tractor back in the 1950s. He'd told me how he'd saved every penny to buy it, how it had been the foundation of everything he'd built. "She's got good bones," he used to say. "Treat her right, and she'll outlast us all." I was so lost in memories that I almost missed it, a glint of metal in the tall grass near the property's back corner. I stopped the tractor and climbed down to investigate. Partially hidden by overgrown weeds was a small metal plate mounted on a concrete post. I brushed away the dirt and vegetation to reveal an engraved brass plaque. Ford 8N Nugro 1. The first of many, 1952. The first of many. I'd never heard this story. I pulled out my phone and searched for information about Ford 8N serial numbers. What I found made my hands shake. According to the Ford archives, the first production Ford 8N tractor, serial number 1, had been lost to history. Collectors had been searching for it for decades. The last estimated value I could find was from an auction house specializing in vintage farm equipment. The number made me sit down hard in the grass, $2.3 million. But that was just the beginning. As I stared at the plaque, I noticed something else, a small arrow pointing toward the old stone well. The stone well sat about 50 yards from where I'd found the plaque, covered by a wooden lid that looked newer than the rest of the structure. I'd walked past this well countless times during my years helping Grandpa, but he'd always warned me to stay away from it. "Old wells are dangerous," he'd say. "Best to leave them be." Now, standing beside it with the tractor idling nearby, I wondered if there was more to his warnings than safety concerns. The wooden cover was secured with a simple latch, and when I lifted it, I expected to see the dark depths of an abandoned water source. Instead, I found a metal ladder leading down into darkness, and the walls were lined with what looked like waterproof storage containers. My heart pounded as I climbed down, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the space. The well had been converted into some kind of storage vault. Shelves lined the circular walls, filled with carefully labeled boxes and containers. The first box I opened contained documents, deeds, certificates, and legal papers dating back decades. As I read through them, a picture began to emerge that I could barely comprehend. Grandpa hadn't just been a simple farmer. He'd been quietly acquiring land, mineral rights, and water rights across 3 counties for over 50 years. The document showed properties I'd never heard him mention, investments in companies that had grown into major corporations, and royalty agreements for oil and gas rights that were still generating income. One folder was labeled, "For Jake," in his familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 3 months ago, along with a key to a safety deposit box and an address in town. The letter began, "If you're reading this, you found the first clue. The tractor was just the beginning." I sat on the bottom rung of the ladder, surrounded by decades of carefully hidden documents, and read Grandpa's letter by the light of my phone. "Jake, I know the will reading was hard. I know you felt forgotten, maybe even betrayed. But I needed everyone to think the tractor was worthless. What you've inherited isn't just a machine, it's a legacy that goes back 3 generations. Your great-grandfather bought that tractor new in 1952 with money he'd saved from selling a small piece of land to Ford Motor Company. What he didn't tell anyone was that the land contained a rare mineral deposit. Ford paid him 10 times what the land was worth, but they also gave him something else, the first tractor off their new production line. I've spent 70 years building on that foundation. Every property deed in this well, every investment, every royalty agreement, it all started with that tractor and the wisdom to keep quiet about real wealth. Marcus got money, but money disappears. You got something that appreciates, something that tells a story, something that connects you to our family's real history. The safety deposit box contains the current financial statements. Last I checked, the total value was approaching $50 million. But more than that, you got the responsibility to continue what we started. This isn't just about money, it's about understanding that true wealth comes from the land, from patience, from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. The tractor still runs because I've maintained it every week for 70 years, just like I've maintained everything else you've inherited. My hands were shaking as I finished reading. $50 million. Hidden in plain sight for decades. The next morning, I drove to the bank in town, the safety deposit box key burning a hole in my pocket. I'd barely slept, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. The bank manager, Mrs. Henderson, had known Grandpa for decades and greeted me with genuine sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Jake. Your grandfather was a good man." When I presented the key and identification, her expression shifted to something like surprise. "Box 247. That's one of our largest boxes. Your grandfather visited it every month for as long as I can remember." The box was indeed large, more like a small filing cabinet than a typical safety deposit box. Inside were more documents, but also something unexpected. A thick folder labeled "Current Holdings" with a date from just 2 weeks before Grandpa's death. I opened it with trembling hands. The financial summary was typed on letterhead from a prestigious investment firm in the state capital. Properties across 3 states. Mineral rights that generated monthly royalties. Stock holdings in companies I recognized. Water rights that were becoming increasingly valuable as droughts affected the region. The bottom line made me sit down hard in the small viewing room. $47.3 million in total assets, all held in a trust that had just transferred to my name. But there was more. A business card was clipped to the summary. Margaret Chen, Trust Manager. A handwritten note was attached. Call me when you're ready. Your grandfather prepared me for this day. I stared at the documents, trying to process what this meant. I wasn't just the grandson who got the tractor. I was now one of the wealthiest landowners in the state, and nobody knew except me. I called Margaret Chen from the bank parking lot, my hands still shaking. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. Jake, I've been expecting to hear from you. Please accept my condolences on your grandfather's passing. He spoke of you often. Her voice was warm but professional. I imagine you have questions. A few, I managed, starting with how this is even possible. She laughed softly. Your grandfather was one of the most patient investors I've ever worked with. He understood something that most people don't, that real wealth is built slowly, quietly, and with a long-term perspective that spans generations. She explained how Grandpa had started with the mineral rights from the original Ford land sale, then systematically reinvested every penny of profit into more land and resources. He'd lived modestly, driving old trucks and wearing worn clothes, while building an empire that nobody suspected. He was particularly proud of the water rights, she continued. He started acquiring them in the 1960s, when nobody thought they'd be valuable. Now, with climate change and development pressure, they're worth more than everything else combined. But why keep it secret? Why not tell the family? He said he needed to know who would value the legacy versus who would just see dollar signs. He watched you work beside him for years, never asking for payment, never complaining about the hard work. He said you understood that some things are worth more than money. I thought about Marcus, already planning how to spend his inheritance, probably unaware that his poor brother now controlled more wealth than he could imagine. What happens now? I asked. Now you decide what kind of steward you want to be. That evening, I sat on Grandpa's front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The old tractor was parked in the yard, looking exactly like what everyone thought it was. A worthless relic from a bygone era. My phone had been buzzing all day, with calls from Margaret Chen's office, lawyers, and property managers, who were now part of my world. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. $50 million wasn't just money. It was power, influence, and the ability to shape the future of entire communities. I thought about what Grandpa had written. True wealth comes from the land, from patience, from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Marcus had called earlier, his voice full of false sympathy. Hey, little brother, I know the will reading was rough. Listen, if you need help getting that old tractor running, I know a guy who buys scrap metal. Might get you a few $100. I'd thanked him and said I was thinking about keeping it for sentimental reasons. He'd laughed and said something about me always being too emotional about junk. If only he knew. But that was the point, wasn't it? Grandpa had taught me that the most valuable things often look worthless to people who don't understand their true nature. The tractor wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol, a reminder, and a test all rolled into one. I pulled out my phone and called Margaret Chen. I've made my decision, I said when she answered. I want to continue what Grandpa started. But I want to do it the same way he did, quietly, patiently, and with respect for the land and the people who depend on it. 6 months later, I was still living in Grandpa's farmhouse, still driving his old pickup truck, and still letting everyone think the tractor was my only inheritance. But behind the scenes, everything had changed. Working with Margaret Chen and her team, I'd started the Grandfather's Legacy Foundation, focused on sustainable agriculture and water conservation. We were quietly purchasing farmland threatened by development and leasing it back to farmers at below-market rates. The foundation was funding research into drought-resistant crops and supporting young farmers who couldn't afford land of their own. Marcus had visited once, pulling up in his new Tesla and shaking his head at my stubbornness in staying on the farm. He'd offered to help me get back on my feet and suggested I consider selling the property to developers who'd been sniffing around. "You could make enough to buy a nice condo in the city," he'd said. "Leave all this behind and start fresh." I'd thanked him for his concern and said I was happy where I was. He'd left shaking his head, probably thinking I was wasting my life on a fantasy of rural living. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he was spending his inheritance on luxury cars and expensive vacations, I was using mine to preserve the kind of life that had created our family's wealth in the first place. The old tractor still sat in the barn, but now I understood its true value. It wasn't worth $2 million because of its rarity. It was priceless because of what it represented. Patience, vision, the wisdom to see value where others see only rust and age. Every morning I'd start it up and drive it around the property, maintaining the fiction while honoring the truth. 1 year after the will reading, Marcus called with news that changed everything. His tech company had failed, a victim of market changes and poor decisions. The $10 million was gone, lost to bad investments and expensive lawyers trying to save a sinking ship. "I hate to ask," he said, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, "but I'm in real trouble. I might lose my apartment, my car, everything. I know you don't have much, but could you help me out? Maybe let me stay at the farm for a while." I looked out the window at the tractor gleaming in the afternoon sun after its weekly maintenance. "Of course," I said. "Family is family." When he arrived the next day, he looked broken. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by jeans and a simple shirt. His Tesla had been repossessed, and he'd driven out in a rental car that he'd have to return soon. "I don't understand how it all went wrong so fast," he said, sitting on the porch where Grandpa used to tell his stories. $10 million and it's just gone. I handed him a beer and sat down beside him. Grandpa used to say that money is like water. If you don't have the right container, it just runs through your fingers. Marcus laughed bitterly. Easy for him to say. He never had real money to worry about. I almost told him then, almost revealed the truth about Grandpa's wealth, about the foundation, about the empire built on patience and wisdom. But something held me back. Maybe it was Grandpa's voice in my head, reminding me about the value of silence. Instead, I said he had something better than money. He had understanding. Over the following months, I watched Marcus slowly transform. Without his wealth and status symbols, he had to rediscover who he was beneath the expensive veneer. I put him to work on the farm, real work, the kind that builds calluses and teaches patience. At first, he complained constantly. His back hurt, his hands were raw, and he couldn't understand why anyone would choose this life. But gradually something shifted. He started to see the satisfaction in fixing a broken fence, the peace in watching crops grow, the deep contentment that comes from working with your hands. One evening, as we sat on the porch after a long day of hay baling, he said something that surprised me. I think I understand now why you stayed. There's something here that I never saw before, something real. I nodded, thinking about Grandpa's words about true wealth. It takes time to see it. I keep thinking about that will reading, Marcus continued. Everyone felt sorry for you, getting just the old tractor, but you never seemed bitter about it. Why? This was the moment I'd been waiting for, though I hadn't realized it until now. Because Grandpa taught me that the most valuable gifts don't always look valuable at first glance. I stood up and walked to the barn, Marcus following behind me. The tractor sat in its usual spot, But now I saw it through his eyes, not as a symbol of hidden wealth, but as a teacher, a reminder of what really mattered. "Want to learn how to drive it?" I asked. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. "Yeah, I'd like that." As I taught him to operate the controls, I realized that Grandpa's greatest gift wasn't the money or the land or even the tractor itself. It was the wisdom to understand that true inheritance isn't what you receive, it's what you learn to give. 2 years after that day in the lawyer's office, I finally told Marcus the truth. We were sitting in the same spot where Grandpa used to tell his stories, and Marcus had just finished his first successful harvest as my farm manager. The foundation had grown to protect over 10,000 acres of farmland, and Marcus had proven himself to be a natural at sustainable agriculture. When I finished explaining about the hidden wealth, the foundation, and the real value of our inheritance, Marcus was quiet for a long time. "You could have told me," he finally said. "When I lost everything, when I was at my lowest point, you could have just written me a check. Would that have helped you find what you were really looking for?" He thought about that, his calloused hands, so different from the soft hands of the businessman he'd once been, wrapped around his coffee mug. "No," he admitted, "I needed to lose everything to understand what I'd never had." The old tractor sat in the yard, still looking like nothing special to anyone who didn't know its story. But we knew. We understood that it represented something more valuable than money, the wisdom to see beyond surface appearances, the patience to build something lasting, and the love of a grandfather who knew that the greatest inheritance is the one that teaches you who you're meant to become. Marcus now runs the day-to-day operations of the foundation, and I've never seen him happier. We've preserved thousands of acres, helped hundreds of young farmers, and continued the legacy that started with a simple land sale and a red tractor in 1952. Sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as disappointments. Sometimes what looks like the end is really just the beginning. Thank you for listening to this story about family, legacy, and discovering that true wealth isn't always what it appears to be. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of the world are you listening from? And if you enjoyed this tale of hidden treasures and family wisdom, please consider subscribing to the channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us what really matters in life. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest inheritances are the ones that don't shine.